All right. Yay! Happy Sunday. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for hanging out, and welcome to Mary Chieffo.
Thank you for having me.
So this is our Star Trek Sunday brunch where we just have an informal chat about all things Star Trek. Well, particularly because Samantha has not watched these before, so we are watching them for the first time with you. So we are going to talk about TNG Redemption, Part 1 and Part 2, and then we are also going to be talking about Darmok. And we invited Mary not just because she's fabulous, but because there is a lot of Klingon politics, and as our resident chancellor, you are best to describe the intricacies of Klingon politics.
Thank you. And I have come fully clothed with the
at your home in Kronos as well.
Got a little
really
out and some puppetry.
Yay!
And yeah, this is the first city. This is like the actual image of from the episode. Or
awesome.
So cool.
Yeah. We are so very prepared. So let's dive right in. We were kind of joking about this earlier before we went live that we're all kind of like super on board with projects and homework.
Big fan.
Yes. Yeah. So this one we had sort of discussed like we've kind of touched on a couple times, but just because there is extensive amount of Klingon politics here. So just to kind of quick overview, this is the battle that's going on between the House Duras is trying to kind of take over, and our good friend Gowron is being all Gowron-y. And the House Duras, particularly the Duras sisters, have sort of teamed up with the Romulans to take over and cause all sorts of mayhem. So from that, I guess let's start with Samantha, because you haven't.
Yeah. So this was the second time I'd watched these episodes, because the first time we had Star Trek Sunday was on a hiatus, so I was just sort of watching them, in the background while cooking and stuff, and then would look up every now and then, be like, "This is really confusing. I do not know what's going on." And then, so last night and the night before, watching them again, actually paying attention, I was like, "This is really confusing. I have no idea what's going on." But no, I got it a little bit more. But the politics run deep. And there's like a lot of different people involved and all these little factions. And then they would bring up names every now and then. And I was like, wait, who's that again? Which one is that? Is that like the term for a group, or is that the name of a person? Or like... So most of my notes were basically like, wait, who's that again? What's...
Right, and can we also appreciate, too, because we kind of touched on this a bit, that this is a 2-part episode, and this is the end of Season 4 going into Season 5, so there's the cliffhanger Tasha Yar Romulan that shows up.
Yes. Playing with my emotions.
Yeah.
I couldn't deal with it.
So, Mary, Samantha loved Tasha when we were first watching this.
Oh, yes, and you're like, as she's talking about how much she loves her, you're like,
Just texting Erin like every other episode in Season 1, like, "Oh my god, I can't wait to talk more about Tasha Yar. She's amazing." And then like my heart was stomped on.
Yeah.
Well, clearly you were not alone, because
right. Yep. So were you able to kind of follow the politics a little bit better this time then?
A little bit, yeah. Just getting more deeper into like the factions, really, because like one takeaway I had from this, which we can probably dive into a little bit later, is they like the Klingons seem to use honor as a front a lot, and they like manipulate each other with it, but they don't talk about the fact that they're manipulating each other with it. So it's like we're all bound together in honor, and then like, but your honor is not as good as your honors. It's like
And then the whole like the quote too that they bring up of like I wrote this down.
Okay.
That's why I wrote this
I
down.
think we both wrote it down in our little
Our little shared thing. It was that you cannot regain honor by acting dishonorably, you know?
Yes, I wrote that down too.
It was just, it's a really interesting one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yes, I was following the politics a little bit closer, but there's still a lot to learn, I feel.
and that's what I'm here for.
So Mary, take it away. Klingon politics in its
Klingon
finest
politics.
form.
We love it.
Please.
Oh, great.
That's
If only they had listened to Laurel, they wouldn't be in this mess.
Right.
I don't know.
Right.
That's I'm sure we'll get into that too, because that is the largest mystery for me. Is I want to know why no one ever talks about Chancellor Laurel, other than obviously we know outside of the storytelling timeline wise when it comes to actual creation of story. But that's just something I'm intrigued by. But so had a lot of different thoughts. Great to come back. So for me, I initially when I was cast as a Klingon, I watched all the Klingon-centric episodes. Even though I wanted to watch every episode, I was just like, I don't have the time. So coming back to Redemptions Part 1 and 2 was really fun because it has been a while since I've watched these specific episodes. And yeah, things that really struck me, I mean, we could talk forever about Worf and his inner conflict and the metaphors there for being a Klingon in the Federation. And I think what you're noting too is like you really get to see the ideas that the Klingons put forth and then the execution. And to me, it's such a great commentary on how our cultures and societies are striving to be something, but not necessarily actually doing it well. Or,
Absolutely.
you know, that there's a lot of ways in which it gets convoluted.
I think it's interesting that Picard is like the one to point that out to Worf kind of in the opening, right? Where he's like, okay, Duras is gone. Like there's an opportunity here to regain the honor. Mm-hmm. And, yeah, we're killing our backgrounds today.
I can't do it, unfortunately.
It's okay.
Very sad.
Samantha blends into her wall. It's fabulous.
Oh man.
Yeah.
But it is fascinating that like you know, Worf is his instincts is like, well, I need patience. I need to, you know, play this carefully. And Picard's like, you super don't. Like, this is Klingon 101. Like, that's Federation mentality, not Klingon.
But Worf is dealing with that throughout the entire two-parter, is like this duality that he's feeling of having been raised by humans but still feeling, I mean, he's full Klingon. So, like, having to reconcile that is a very interesting journey to watch.
Yeah, I think it really illuminates again this theme of like the idea of who you are, or like, you know, all of our storytelling, certainly on the mythological level, is about like, you know, choice and what we are inherently, what are we genetically, who are we as, you know, from that. Like we can't reject our heritage and our past, but we can utilize it. We don't have to be it, but it is always going to be a part of us. And I do feel that Worf is such a great example of that. I mean, I think every character within TNG and pretty much all of Trek, you know, that's what we love, is we see the inner conflict. And
yeah, I think when we see that with other characters, sometimes they're a little bit more conscious of it. And I feel like Worf has muddled that it's like he knows that he's different, but hasn't delineated in his mind like what's the nature versus nurture side of like, is my behavior Federation or is it Klingon? He just like doesn't know. He's just
Well, yeah, actually, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Toward the end of Redemption 2 last night, I was like, this really makes me want to watch Voyager again and pay more attention to B'Elanna, who I also love, because she deals with this as well, like the duality of her Klingon half and her human half. And there's that great episode when they split, you know, and she has to face her Klingon half in a way. And so I really, that's an identifiable sort of storyline. So I was getting more interested in that, and Worf represents it super well. You're right.
Yeah, and something I love about Klingons overall is that they are so passionate. Like I was having a conversation the other day, and it's not just brutal. It's not just brutality. And a note I wrote was like, and I definitely will do more intense on the politics and the Civil War and all that sort of stuff. But like, brutality doesn't mean power. And I think that that's where the Klingons often lose their way, is that they also have this tendency when their passion isn't utilized in a helpful way. That's why you have so much infighting, is that they have not honed their passion and their power. And I think that strikes me because that's a theme in my life and part of what resonated for me in playing with L'Rell. L'Rell, that's a whole other thing too, because of the society she's in and what part of the timeline. These Klingons also, like, I do think it's important to note that we're looking at a post-Praxis explosion Klingon empire. And and there's a real distinction because even though they still have their own empire, they are still much more influenced by the Federation. Even though, as we see in earlier times, there is a certain level of allyship. What, funnily enough, Takuba was afraid of happening is ultimately happening in many different ways. That they have become, they haven't been, watered down per se. They still are very obviously intense and brutal, as we see in that excellent fight scene.
Yes.
Bar scenes and all that. But I really enjoy looking at it from a historical perspective, that they still have their own entity, but there has been a lot that has happened since we initially met the Klingons in Enterprise.
Right.
I'm like in between whether doing more on the war side or more on the politics side. Is there any
so yeah, I mean, I think the last thing I just wanted to say about Worf before we get into the politics is it strikes me as interesting, and it felt very natural that he left the Federation. And it's interesting that they just had that be one episode, that it was like he's gone and then he's back. But it didn't.
Welcome to 90s television.
Right. The contract worked out, so but I think it still felt natural. I feel like he still had a story arc, even in a very contained story, that he did in a very intense way learn a lot about, who he is and Klingon behavior and where he fits in it. And I think talking about that bar scene real quick, which we'll come back to, but how confused he was that, like, they're fighting each other. He's like, wasn't that the dude from the ship yesterday? And they're yeah. We're all Klingons down here, man.
You get this great contrast of the idea of something and the reality of something. And for him, it's like, I mean, he's studied all up. He knows Klingon culture. He knows about how Klingons are supposed to be. And one of the quotes that I wrote down from part 2 in the bar scene, which I'm sure we'll get back to, but which also I have a thing where I'm very much a child, and anytime someone talks about their duty, I giggle. But it's just the seed was planted early on in my brain, and now I just giggle. But I really liked is there nothing in your heart but duty? That's what Kern says to Worf, and like it's like, I mean, isn't that what it should be? And so much of Worf's struggle is his I think he's so intent on being a good Klingon and being a good member of the Federation. Like he is so driven by that then it causes what we I think we all noted the scene with Guinan and laughing that. And I definitely relate to that, because when I'm really trying to do something, it's like, you can just relax. He's like, no, I'm going to be a good Klingon.
Right. I thought that was an interesting scene, because it really represented that, like, Klingons don't laugh, and she's like, no, you don't laugh. Like, there's individuality within being a Klingon, and it doesn't seem like that's super appreciated among Klingons. So that's the mentality that he has. But like, they're so banded together behind all their beliefs and their passion, that he's had, like, trying to find that individuality is it seems like a struggle. But her pointing that out was like, there are differences. Like, you can be a different person.
yeah, it's really lovely. Love Guinan. I mean, every time she comes on screen, I'm just a happy clam.
Yeah, she's fabulous.
Okay.
I really like how because I think what it's relatable to is that they it's this idea of like you going to a party with a bunch of people that you want to be really good friends with and you behave as if you think like how they should behave. And they're like, dude, that's not how we roll. And it's like you trying to fit in so hard is what makes you stand out even more. And I think that that's exactly what Worf is dealing with here, you know.
That's a really good analogy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which but it is, and I think too we didn't, because we get more exposed to Klingons in a natural environment in Deep Space Nine, but that hadn't aired at this point, and so we were starting to see the the fact that Klingons do goof around and they're hard drinking, and I wrote they're like my ideal Viking / pirate / Klingon, cheers, and and I love that.
And we get a little bit of that in Voyager too, actually.
Yeah.
That I was remembering that as well.
We're all sitting around.
Yeah. It's like, I think because now that we live in a world where we have had the Deep Space Nine and the Void, like there's been so much development that it's really fun to go back and realize, these were the very first seeds getting planted. Really, I mean, obviously we still have in TOS. Obviously very, very iconic episodes with Klingons that are super great and have a lot of great things to say about preconceived notions of people and propaganda and all that sort of stuff. But it is the actual fleshing out of the culture that really starts happening here, which is fun.
It is fun. And also she kicks his butt at the game, which is fabulous.
Yes.
Oh yes. Without a blink of the eye.
Yeah. Right. No fanfare, just like,
I'm just gonna tell you everything that you're dealing with. Like the best therapist ever. She's like, this is what you're working on, and good night.
It's awesome. So let's transition then to the politics, particularly the Duras sisters. I think are just, we love the Duras.
We love them. We also see them in a 2020 perspective and the way in which women are portrayed. A little bit. But so we'll start with that because I have a lot of like with the Civil War. I mean, my joke as I was going through it was, I was like, and y'all said the disco Klingon politics were complicated.
I think I followed those more easily than this.
But tying in then with the Duras sisters, just this Klingon need for conflict that we were talking about earlier, their need to fight, like they have this primal instinct to be aggressive. And it is often channeled in civil wars. And I might note that it's like we hear from Gowron that women cannot serve on the council, which is interesting. Still curious why that is, guys. I know that there is some in the novelization. I believe that there's a little bit.
I think so.
There. Post Undiscovered Country politics, but anyway. Just an interesting note, and I'll go more in the Duras sister direction, and I'm sure that will tie into more of the facts of the conflict. But I mean, that is just like a very interesting thing to note, because what I always found in the Duras sisters, because I really was keeping an eye on all the female Klingons when I was going through and how they conducted themselves and why, is it is given to us that this culture is the patriarchy, that women are still fierce and obviously, as we see, like by human standards, very aggressive and very sexually aggressive. But then you see within the world, of course, the Duras sisters behave the way they do because their society tells them that they must work in a subversive way, which was something that I really borrowed in the first season for L'Rell. Was like she says, I work from the shadows, and that's precisely what the Duras sisters do. And yes, on a a superficial level, we could say that they're just power hungry and they just enjoy being evil and all that. But if we really look at it from a historical perspective, if we look at a lot of female characters and historical women, they often behave that way because it's the only way they can attain power, and through some sort of pawn where you have the lovely
that poor kid, man. That poor kid. Gowron definitely stabbed him in the sleep, like, after that episode.
Oh my god. Also, that actor, like, that kid, he's such a tween, like, he's such a teenager. He's just like, yeah, man, I'm gonna be the ruler. It's just excellent. So that was something that I just noted in their portrayal, and obviously, you know, those actors are wonderful playing the part, and they go for it.
Oh, they're fabulous. Do they and I'm just maybe not remembering this, but Trek fan in the chat was talking about how they were scarred because of their bloodlines that began like in Enterprise. But then how much do the Duras sisters know about the Kittimer massacre? Like, do they know that it was their dad that was responsible? I'm trying to remember, like, when Worf initially... Right. They do, right? Like, they know.
I think so. I would have to... I'll give a 99% yes. But yeah, that is a good question. Because
well, that was another thing too, and correct me if I'm wrong, but they seem to be saying our brother did this thing, not their dad. Am I misremembering that? They're like, our brother's crimes are not our crimes, or something.
Was it their dad? I thought it was their dad.
Maybe it was their
Klingon politics, man.
Their brother, because is not their dad. Well, oh right, no, this is the question. That's the politics of it. You're tying into what Grilka has to deal with later,
right?
Which is the idea that they cannot ascend to that same level of power because
right.
But that is a good question. Anyone in the chat?
This is why we do this live.
Klingon politics have left the chat.
Yeah.
They're like, it's complicated. We just know we want power.
Just so complicated.
Boob windows.
Yeah.
Yes, we cannot not mention the boob windows, which I must say were particularly aggressive in these episodes.
They were particularly aggressive. They are memorable, I think.
I was watching with my mom, and I was like, oh, get ready, the boob windows are coming. She was like, what? And then she looked up and she was like, oh my. Which I know people have said that part of that, other than the, you know, people like seeing boobs, is that the idea is that they're so confident in their ability that they're like, you can get me.
There is something to that, you know. It is and that's always that interplay, and I think it more has to go on, when the costuming goes to that level, which we've seen with strong female characters in other sci-fi and within Trek itself that are dressed a certain way for a certain audience. If the writing makes up for that they're still you know, that can then seem less superficial and more of like an empowerment for a viewer who it's not necessarily targeted for. I guess is the way to put that.
Right.
You know, this is something that, not to go deep into all my feminist theory and all that stuff, but it is something that feminism struggles with perpetually. Is it the rejection of the body? Is it the celebration of the body? And you see it in feminist art all the time, and like, depending on the decade, in the past, you know, 50 some years, it toggles between the two, and I think it really is a personal thing. And I definitely found, obviously in the second season, we did get a little bit more cleavage from L'Rell, but then as she ascends into the mother role, we then made it more conservative again. And this is much earlier in the timeline, but that was definitely something that we did deliberately. Like, I mean, Gersha came up with the ideas, and I said, that's great. We did, I will, to Gersha's credit, like, she was always very into discussion and did so much research, and we would really talk about, like, what does this symbolize, particularly the speech. There were like two different dress options, and we decided on the one that was more conservative, because it felt like it was a commentary on, you know, the difference between, you know, we have the Madonna horror, you know, like, you know, what is that, and what is it to embody one or the other. Anyway,
it's interesting.
It is fascinating. I mean, like you were saying, Mary, I read the similar note of with the Duras sisters. they're using every tool at their disposal, including their sexuality, to try and obtain power and prove themselves in that way. And we see that through centuries of work and women's roles in trying to obtain power and maintain power and be powerful. And what does that mean?
Especially through the hapless front, like through the kid, to be like, all right, you go do that thing. You do. Oh, that's nice that you think that you're in charge here. Like, that's
right, exactly. Yeah.
I do.
Yeah, segueing into the more hilariously complicated but very, I think, great political commentary on our own politics with Gowron's ties. Like, I love that it's like, I'm looking at my notes just to make sure I explain it well, because again, it is complicated, but saying so that he's loyal, that most of the council is loyal to Duras, and so he can't expose their treachery, the Duras sisters' treachery, for his own political safety and gain.
Right.
And then you also have Worf with Kern encouraging him to now have an allyship with Gowron for their own personal gain. And like, I just really celebrated the fact that it's complicated politics, and I think it's easy to assume that the Klingons, or ultimately any alien species, is like one thing. Like, we see this with Vulcan culture all the time too, or Romulans, but particularly I often think of with Vulcans and Klingons very different, but the way in which we're like, oh, well, Vulcans don't have emotion. And that's absolutely not true. And, Klingons are very straightforward and brutalistic and just want to kill. And it's like, no, they have this idea of honor that they try to adhere to. But as we see in every country, and it's a lot is being illuminated now, we have all of these ideals that countries and cultures are founded upon, but the way to attain them and politics are innately not perfect, and the way people, and so I really appreciated that we got to see that, and with Gowron, he's not perfect, but you get that he's better in a lot of ways.
I mean, the dude is savvy. Like, I gotta respect that. And I think, like, Mohammed kind of put it as saying this variation within species, but it's still that desire to make it as simple as possible. And I think that that's how Gowron feels about consolidating the power, that it's like, it's gonna get too complicated if we out the Duras family. Like, like, it's not, we're gonna have to explain it. Like, the family will be like dishonored, but it's just gonna be too difficult for people to comprehend in this like nonsense that's going on right now.
Right.
And now we have Romulans in the picture.
Yeah,
exactly. That whole element too is like, and I think that that's an interesting distinction. Like, part of how we're able to be like, well, we're really not on the Duras side is that they're being very subversive in their, the Romulans allow us to decide who we like. Well, at least Gowron's like all about the Klingons. Like, if you're going to be the Chancellor of the Empire, like, you should be invested in the Klingons and not be someone else's puppet.
So Darmok here has a question that's really good that says, if Gowron did not have the carrot of restoring Worf's honor, would Worf have joined in the fight? Like the family House of Moog.
Yeah, I think that is a great question.
I mean, it's because he's part of him wants to be a part of this awesome Klingon drinking crazy culture, knowing that he's not, but now he can't be. And so it is, so when there is an opportunity to go in and restore that honor and be welcome once again, it's that, I get that is tempting, but I think if that wasn't an option, like if this was presented to him in a way that he wasn't necessarily going to restore his family honor, that he'd still be able to help but not restore his honor, I'm not Not sure if he would.
Yeah, I mean, oh, Samantha, go.
No. I was just trying to remember back to when his honor was destroyed. That had to do with the Duras family, right? Like he had to take some kind of fall for what they did.
Yeah, that was exactly it. It was because his father was dead, and so he basically accepted the shame of the family of the House of Moog, in lieu of the Duras, who did actually murder was responsible for the Kittimer massacre, I believe. And he basically was like, all right, we'll just say that my dad did it, because my dad's long gone. I'm part of Starfleet. We'll just shame the family because it doesn't have big picture, really. The needs of the many, as it were.
Yeah. Right.
Classic.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's interesting because something I wrote in my notes too was like just his major through line, Worf's major through line is this restoration of honor. I mean, I don't think it's an accident that it's redemption is the name of these episodes.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting that it's redemption and not another term like that. Like it's there's something like redemption is very tricky, like and ultimately the choice that he makes to not kill Toril is I mean, that's where we get to see Worf being himself and making his choices based on his experience and based on both cultures that he's a part of. And that's enough redemption for him. Like, it's getting the honor back. That is his goal. And he doesn't go further than that, which I think is possibly illuminating what a flaw that the Klingons tend to have, is like they go one step too far often as a passionate species.
Well, and if we go back to him desiring so much at the beginning to be Klingon and to portray himself as a Klingon in front of all of his Klingon bros, this is an opportunity where he actually rejects that in order to fit in and appear as Klingon as possible, he'd kill the kid, because he's like, no, I'm not going to.
Yeah, and Kern drops
that was definitely
so many quotes. Oh, go ahead.
Were you gonna say something? Sorry.
That's definitely was the defining moment of like he could have gone either way, and he went that way.
Yeah, and Kern literally says, "It is the Klingon way." by the novel, and but there are a lot of great little Klingon quote nuggets in both of these episodes, and that was definitely kind of and I think it draws into question, what is the Klingon way? Like, I think that's what Kern believes, and is it? But and the fact that Gowron is responsible enough to actually hear him, as we said, maybe he goes and stabs him in the night.
I'm sure he
does. At least on an exterior level, we get a little bit of that respect, and I find this to be true with great leaders. Again, something that I infused into L'Rell as well, is like a good leader is someone who comes from their own experiences, but then is willing to listen and is like smart enough to have to take in the experiences they have and base their decisions off of that, as opposed to what they think is right and wrong based off of their upbringing. And I think that you see that.
Yeah, as well as recognizing other people's experiences, bring them to where they are, I think.
Yeah, and when he puts that trust in Worf to say, this is your move, and he accepts it, that there is that level of trust there. That is really interesting. So let's talk briefly then about Vulcan Tasha Yar, or Romulan Tasha Yar.
Yeah.
What?
I just the degree to which it's quite a story. It's quite a story as to how she exists.
So if I have this down, back in season 3, there was like it was the Yesterday's Enterprise, or tomorrow's Yesterday's Enterprise.
Yeah.
There's the temporal rift, and Tasha Yar is there, and after she's been dead, and the Enterprise C is there, and Guinan basically tells Tasha the timeline's messed up, man. You were not supposed to be here,
Right?
And she's like, well, that's messed up, and gets on the Enterprise C, and goes to fight the Romulans, and scene.
Right.
Until now.
Yes.
Until now, and then.
Which, for next gen, is surprising, the amount of serialization that they're expecting the viewer to remember one episode. Because they barely describe this in Redemption.
They really they really expect you to remember. And I was like, I was like, wait, there was this thing with Gyna.
Yeah.
And Tasha and
it's trying to follow the episode at the same time, and I was like,
it's so difficult, and they it's even when they describe it, and then she's like, you have 14 hours, and walks out, I'm like, I'm not sure I can't follow that.
Very strange.
Very strange. I will say, I love seeing Denise Crosby do her thing. The way that she plays that character is really, really fun. Also, just, the kind of lack of like how she exists when it comes to the relationship that Tasha had with that Romulan.
No kidding.
And it's like, it's interesting because obviously she's on the side of her father, like her Romulan side won out. As she ratted on her mom and got her killed when she was 4 years old.
Right, when she was 4. I was like, this is expecting a lot of a 4-year-old.
Yes.
Do any of you know 4-year-olds? Because
it also tracks that, like, even though she's like I'm all Romulan now, but Tasha is such a strong-willed, character that actually I think there's a lot more of Tasha in her than she realizes. Like, she thinks it's her Romulan side, but like that, because I agree. I like that.
It did kind of remind me, and Samantha hasn't seen these yet, but it did remind me of what's her name? Oh my god, Kira from Deep Space Nine and the Cardassians, because it's like with the whole, I mean, it's dodgy on so many levels, but when they flash back to like the Cardassian occupation of Deep Space Nine, there's similar references and behaviors that were going on, but it's just kind of like, ooh. Great origin story, bro.
I think what I really like, it's really good to remember that there is a lot of war and death and not great like it's alluded to. I think we can show a lot more now, or for better or for worse, in storytelling overall, not just with Trek but just overall. But I think it's great to come back to these episodes and be like, right, no, there's a lot of crazy politics going on here. There's a lot of crazy like manipulation, that sort of stuff.
And Muhammad made a good point that it's possible that they basically retconned the story for the 4-year-old. Like, that as a parent, we definitely rewrote our narratives. So that's fair. I'll give you that one.
That could be,
I like it. I'm trying. So is any other with that particular?
Not for me. Samantha, did you have any other thoughts about our Romulan Tasha? Sayla's her name, but Romulan Tasha.
No.
Yeah.
Romtosh.
The last one before we get to Darmok, because I want to make sure we got time to talk about that. But I do want to talk about Data as command.
Yes.
With Hobson. So I don't know, Samantha, if you want to throw in your thoughts on that first. Watching Data
when he's in command of the ship.
Yeah.
Personally, I thought that the first officer may have had a point that Data maybe should not be in command of a ship. Obviously, he made the right choices in that instance, but I feel like, as we've seen from the captains that I've seen, Janeway and Picard so far, having that human component of emotion is kind of essential. And yeah, I feel like we saw in this instance it worked out, but in other instances he may have had blind spots.
Yeah. What about you, Mary?
I made a note. I remember when I watched the episode the first time, this was one of those moments and plots that really stuck with me, and particularly with Data, who I just love as a character so much, because you get another. It's not necessarily duality, but in a way it is, because it it's the humanity he craves, and but also what I found was that his choice, while it isn't necessarily human, it was an instinctual, while it was logical, I felt it was also the actions he took. If a human had done it, we'd be like, oh yeah, he trusted his gut. And so I found that was kind of that was the switch that we ultimately see, is that while it felt like he was doing something that was inhuman or lacked empathy or understanding of like the lives that were at risk, it was something more impulsive. Like, I mean, I don't know, like if what would we think if Kirk had done that, or any of these more notoriously, like, shoot from the hip type characters, and like because it's Data, we see it in a different light. But that was kind of, I think, what I took away from
that's a really good point, because my initial, I mean, I immediately, when, Hobson's being a jerk, I'm like, give Data a chance. Like,
yeah.
Stop being mean to him. And then even when it, like, when they're making command decisions behind his back and everything, I'm like, not cool, guys. Give Data, he's your captain. But then, like, when he does defy the orders, for my initial instinct was like, ooh, kind of see the point, and I kind of thought about it a little bit like Samantha did, of saying, oh, this is maybe not. But I really like your point of, well, what if like a human captain had done this? And I think it speaks not necessarily to him being an android, but I think more speaks to a lack of experience, that whether it is human or programming to defy Picard, and not respond to hails and just do your thing without listening to anyone, that would be a human who's not ready for command. That would be something that they would do. So it's interesting.
Yeah.
I will also say what Picard says though at the end is that, like, in history we've seen so many people do things because they were just obeying orders, and they haven't resulted well. I think I felt in the arc, to have such a strong story within this episode where so much else is going on was really impressive. And that moment, you get, what's great is you had a lot more of that with Picard and Worf in part 1, and then you still get some of that in part 2, but you do get to have this other element of the, Picard really showing his true colors too, of empathy and compassion. And it was reminiscent to me of him allowing Worf to use the Khitomer Accords, like the Federation information there, that what we get to celebrate about Picard as a captain and a leader is that he respects the rules, but he's willing to bend them for the right reasons. And he says to Data, nicely done. So it feels like he sees something of himself, obviously, in Data. And obviously the Picard-Data relationship is a big thing.
It's a thing. It's a thing.
It's a thing.
But it's it is. I had something really profound and then it disappeared from my
oh no.
The curses. Oh, it reminded me of the episode in Voyager where Janeway lets Harry Kim lead a mission. And he kind of steps all over himself. And I think that, but it's like, okay, this was a learning experience. You know? And I feel that that's kind of similar to what Data went through here.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like in life in general. I mean, these are obviously heightened circumstances, and like this, I think this will be a great segue into Darmok, actually, with mythology. And like we look to these stories because they're metaphors for, see, look guys, it's just gonna slip right in.
Right away, Mary, you got this.
It's happening. But they are metaphors for our own experiences, and while none of us are commanding a ship, the idea of being allowed to learn from experience, I mean, and I am very feel very strongly about this when it comes to representation and putting people in positions of power, Obviously it should be people that are, you know, at the training level or ready to take that next step, but no one is perfect, and if we don't learn from experience, we will never be able to move to that next level and become better leaders. So, and I feel like that is obviously a huge theme that we see throughout all of Trek.
Yeah.
Definitely.
When do we allow, when are people ready?
Mhm.
How do we also what do I say, balance, you know, understanding where people come, like whether it be Data or Worf,
Mhm.
when do we trust them, when do we
Yeah.
expect them to move past their innate, you know, genetic makeup. It's so, and
Mhm.
you know, I don't think the question is ever fully answered. It's, we see examples, but we don't, there's never one like, and this is how it, this is what we should be doing.
Right.
But,
And it's interesting with the and like you said, it's fabulous transition to Darmok because it's our expectations of storytelling
yeah,
that here, and like, you know, Dave pointed out and we've been kind of discussing that there are, Star Trek as a whole deals with identity issues all the time. And there, you know, there's people between Spock and the Doctor and 709 and Data and Worf and all of these, of what it means to be a part of the Federation, what it means to be a part of their species. And
Mhm.
but then when we're faced with a culture, and all of those are done from a very human and Federation centric view, that we go, oh, you didn't do that because that wasn't right, because that's not what I would have done, or that's not what our species would have done. But then we're introduced in Darmok to a species where it's like can't even communicate with them to begin to understand their differences.
Yeah.
So Mary, had you seen this episode before?
I had not seen this episode before. It was funny because as I was watching it, I was like, this is a classic episode. Like, you know, you watch certain ones and you're just like, oh, okay, this is definitely, how have I not seen this one? Because I loved it. And exactly, I mean, I'm gonna let you take the reins because you know it and love it so well. But it was awesome. I'm so glad that I have now seen it.
It is. It's amazing. And Samantha, you said like when you watched this for the first time, you were like, "Oh, this is really good."
Yeah.
Yes. Like, yeah, I really, really loved it. It just, I don't know, the whole idea behind, you know, how they're using language and how they're commenting on language and how language is informed by mythology and by our culture. There was so many nuances and themes and metaphors that I just like completely loved it. And I felt, I think I mentioned to Erin a couple days ago, like I feel like you really see like Shakespearean actor Patrick Stewart in this.
100%.
Like he was like eating it up. I was like, yes.
Totally.
I love it. I mean, this is probably, it's definitely my favorite TNG episode, and it's probably in my top 5 Star Trek all-time episodes, because, and it's one too I recommend to people who just want to watch one episode of Star Trek to try to get it. You know? Because it's so, I just think it's such a fascinating way of storytelling, and it's such a fascinating arc as a viewer that you're along for this ride as just as much as the characters are, because when you're first introduced to it, you're like, oh, it's an alien language, you know, and they're like, oh, we've, you know, tried communicating with the species, the Tamarians, before, but we haven't been able to, and then they're up on the view screen and they start talking, and as a viewer, you immediately are like, oh, alien language, like, you know, universal translator broken. And then you start to pick up the fact that the only words that you're missing are just the proper nouns, that they are speaking sentences, and you're just not realizing what they're referencing. And then I love that the way they set it up. So Data and Troy are on the ship piecing it together, which, by the way, my Alexa responds to computer, and it really got messed up during this episode. They're like, define the Temerian storyline. Computer, go do this. And I was like, God!
Oh, yeah.
Normally it's okay, but this one really messed it up.
Oh, that's amazing.
But they start to piece together these stories of like who Darmok is and what Tanagra was and all of this at the same time that Picard is starting to piece together what he's trying to convey. And as a viewer, you're like, yeah, Picard, like, so close.
Yeah.
And just the beauty too, just to kind of finish that arc as a viewer. But I love the fact that then at the end of the episode, when Picard is back up on the ship, talking to the Temerians to tell them what happened, he's communicating with them in their language, but we as a viewer are able to understand it almost completely, that he, they say, I wrote all these down, but, he explains Darmok and Jalad at Tanagra, Darmok and Jalad on the ocean, and he says, Sokoth, his eyes open, like, yes, he understands.
Yeah.
And then he explains that he was killed, and the Temba, his arms wide, that they have a conversation that is very similar to what we were introduced with at the beginning of the episode that made no sense to us. And so just as a viewer, the fact that we were then able to communicate with the Temerians, I just love. I love it.
Yeah, it's really profound and beautiful, and it's very moving. And you feel that too. Like I love watching the crew at any point, like what if they have a bunch of lines or not, and you see that too when Worf, at the end of part 1, moves through everyone, and you see the main crew with him. But I always love seeing, and some of the regular characters that don't have any dialogue, but you feel that level of respect from them in that moment with Picard. You see, oh, he's learned something. And I just love that. You see the level of respect, and he and Riker have such a lovely, I think, exchange. It's just you see the respect for him as a leader.
Yeah, and I mean, this episode also did a wonderful job of, there was some tension involved with, like, there's the bridge crew on the Enterprise is like, there's this hostile event that has taken place, like they've kidnapped our captain, and while that's happening and they're trying to like figure that out, Picard's on the surface, like slowly getting to know, oh, this is not hostile, there's something going on here. So there's that whole tension as well that's going on.
And I love,
it just makes it really good.
One of the things that I pointed out was the Romeo and Juliet analogy, right, when they start to figure out the language that they're speaking, because it's a perfect analogy for this, because as the use of metaphors as sharing emotions, because academically, having actually read Romeo and Juliet, it's angsty hormonal teenagers with communication issues and are not like, who have known each other for not that long and make very serious life decisions that you're just like, and so you don't want to hold it up as like, this is a paragon of love. But yet, in our society, referencing Romeo and Juliet does mean this true, passionate, undying love. And it's just so fascinating that that we have crossed into that reference as a metaphor for love. Even when you study the story itself, it's like,
Right, exactly. It just becomes that kind of shorthand of knowing what it means, because it's so ingrained in our culture. And I thought at the end, like when Picard was reading the Greek works, he was like, familiarity with our own mythology as well could be just as important, as we consider language and how we use it and what things have started to mean. Because there's a point there where you can also start to recognize what is actually mythology as opposed to truth or fact. And like when I was writing that on my notes, like the Hamilton example, like kind of sprang into my head, because that started to expose for a much larger group of people, I think, the mythology of the founding fathers. And we feel it, we feel that really deeply. And yet what that started to break down was who in the society is feeling that as deeply or in different ways.
Yeah.
And the language that we use to express our independence, and this is the American, you know,
right.
culture and personality. But not everyone necessarily maybe relates to it in the same way. So when we saw Hamilton, you know, really pushing that limit of that mythology by particularly the casting choices and everything, it started to go, it really helps you reassess how we express our mythology that way, and how much our mythology is ingrained in how we think.
Yeah.
So I mean, there was so much to this episode to unpack.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, something that I've said on a million panels is that this is our modern mythology, and I was saying that earlier too. And I think that there's just the layers of that. You have Picard looking at the Greeks, and we know he loves Shakespeare, who was looking at the Greeks. I mean, that's the thing, is like Shakespeare was the best adapter. He's an amazing writer, but he's the best adapter. Like, he was able to take all of these stories that already existed and recalibrate them to his time. And, you know, some he sets in the past, some he sets but and we continue to do that. And it doesn't mean that each reiteration isn't unique. It just means that there are certain themes that we just keep coming back to because we haven't figured them out yet. You know, it is like this idea of humanity, which at another point we'll do a whole like alien perspective of like why humanity is like the big thing, because I always kind of had that feeling, but particularly now that I've been an alien who had like was very like, these are my principles, and then I'm like, why is it so great to be human? But anyway, we'll talk about it later. This is like a teaser for more discussions to come.
Right.
But,
yeah.
But I do think that as someone who grew up with mythology, actually Greek mythology, Norse mythology, it was a big part of my elementary school education, and then fantasy, loving, you know, everything from Narnia to Harry Potter, and then sci-fi overall. It allows me to process my own life so much better than a lot of contemporary things. The closer things are to me, I can enjoy them, but I don't process what I'm dealing with because it's too like, well, that's not my experience. And I think that it's very interesting to observe. Some people have that inclination with mythology, or like they see the metaphor. And some people take things very literally. And when you're a part of a story that is very mythological and metaphorical, it's interesting to see when people take it very literally that they can lose the true meaning. And the archetypes, I mean, like what we're coming back to. And so it's interesting for me to learn and observe as someone who is so into that when that's not how people process stories.
Well, and it's interesting too because that's kind of what they portray. And I know we're kind of hitting the hour, so I don't want to go on too long, but it's interesting that that's what this culture has reached, that point where they have the metaphor of Darmok and Jalad Tanagra, but they can't step back and explain what that story is. They're like, it's just Darmok and Jalad Tanagra. And I feel like that's kind of the stories that we're at. You know, if you pull the Star Trek thread, right? If we were to say like, you know, Spock and Kirk in the warp core, we would, people who love Star Trek immediately know. And if people were like, what? You'd be like, dude, there's no way I can explain what that metaphor is and what that means.
Because it's so tied to the emotional experience.
Right. And it's like, even if I did have the time and the language capacity to explain it to you, I'm afraid I wouldn't be able to get that emotion across. You know?
Absolutely. Yes.
Facts and feelings aren't always perfectly coherent.
I will say just one of the things I loved about this episode was when they're trying to communicate, they do it when you don't understand what somebody's saying in another language, you always slow down and speak louder. Darmok and Jalad.
It's just Temba, his arms wide. Temba.
And it's just so brilliant.
Yeah, and it is absolutely archetypes. So on that note, I just want to thank you, Mary, for joining us this time.
Yay, thank you.
Thanks for having me. It was so much fun.
It's the first time. It will not be the last time.
No. I don't have anything to say about it.
Awesome. And yeah, I appreciate everyone hanging out in the chat. I'm sorry we didn't necessarily get to answer some of the questions that, but we're keeping an eye on, and they were all awesome points. And I really appreciate, even if you weren't able to join in the chat, if you were just listening, we appreciate that as well. So thank you again. And any final words, you guys? Say farewell. All right. Live long and prosper. Awesome.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Also, kudos to Patrick Stewart for having to speak a fair amount of Klingon in Redemption. I was like, all right, man. Like 10 times.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And thank you, Darmok. That's the perfect way to end this. So, Rob, his sails unfurled.
Yeah.
Right. Carry on. Have a good one, guys. I really appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye.